Welcome back. We are continuing with Going Native, written by Uncle Sealing. Going Native, Chapter 11. Stace's footsteps crunched delicately on the fresh snow as he made his way from the cabin. It felt as if with each step he was going back in time, away from this bizarre new reality and back towards the simple life he has made for himself. During his first years he had hunted like this, trying to balance the equation of food versus cold versus ammunition. He had laid out snares, built traps, used a slingshot to hunt squirrels and rabbits. He ate rose hips and made pemmican with wolf meat and wild berries. True subsistence living. It was tough, but he had done it. Now, though, it was impossible. He had figured the big alien would eat more than he did, but watching what he thought was going to be at least a couple days' worth of fish get devoured in 2 meals by the pair had cemented the problem in his mind. The 3 of them would be done with the supplies in the cabin quickly. Even if Stace could fill the gap afterwards with hunting, vitamin deficiency could kill them just as dead as starvation would. No, what the 3 needed was some big game, and they needed it now. They could use it to space out the other supplies and stop them from dying of scurvy or any of the other diseases he couldn't remember the name of. There were a few different options for medium and large game in the area. If his feet didn't hurt so much, he would have gone north. A Dall sheep would be a nice start and an easier hunt, but Stace had to be realistic. He wasn't going to last long enough to keep going out for multiple easy hunts. They needed to stockpile as many calories as he could get as quickly as possible. Ideally he'd go for a moose, but there was no way he'd be able to get a moose back to the cabin. Maybe if he had a sled of some kind, but there wasn't time to build one. No, what Stace needed right now was a caribou. Santa wouldn't be pleased, but if his strength held out he might be able to get a bull back to the cabin. If not, a doe wasn't that much bigger than a Dall sheep. The caribou herds tended to follow similar paths year to year, and Stace had a pretty good idea of where he was likely to find them. It was only 2 or 3 kilometers. On foot. Through the snow. If he was lucky, he might even make it back alive. Out of everything Ian expected Ellora to do now that she was armed and ostensibly in charge, handing over the pistol was not anywhere on the list. He knew nothing about weapons despite his wife being in the military. She was a data analyst and as far as he knew she hadn't so much as touched a weapon since basic training. Ian missed her terribly, but at least she was safe. Distraught, he was sure, but safe. This whole situation was so out of Ian's experience that it was laughable. He had gone to a nice school, met a nice girl who was feminine without being overbearingly so and shared similar interests, gotten married. Even when Marion had been posted to Earth, he managed to find things to do to keep busy. He fended off other suitors, he certainly didn't want to start courting someone Marion might not like, got a pilot license so he could pull in extra credits and have something to do. It was all so normal. Now he had to decide if he wanted to trust a human-hating Marine. If he took the pistol, Stace would be safe, but if things were as bad as Stace had said, they might need the gun and the trained Marine. Could he hand it back to her in time if there was a crisis? What if he lost it? Goddess help him, Ian just wanted to go home.
Please don't let me regret this.
Ian reached out gently and put his hand on the pistol, pushing it back towards Ellora. She pulled it back, but gestured for him to come closer.
Safety, cell release, trigger.
Ellora pointed to each part.
This particular weapon doesn't have a stun setting. If you look here,
she said, gesturing at a circle divided like a pie into sections under the rear sight.
You can see the ammo count. The wedges will glow 1 for each remaining shot. We only have 10 shots with this thing.
She held the pistol out again, pressing it into Ian's hands. He took it carefully, making sure to keep it pointed at the ground. It was too big for his hand and felt awkward. When Ellora's hands wrapped around Ian's, his first instinct was to pull away. Instead, he let her readjust his hands, showing him a two-handed grip that, while not comfortable, would at least let him access all the controls. Once Aang felt like he had at least a basic understanding, he passed the weapon back to Ilera, who leaned over to place it on the table. Aang let out a low breath as some of the built-up stress left him.
Well, Stace is gone, but we probably shouldn't be sitting around doing nothing while he's out being the provider as if we're a couple of noble husbands with a house full of servants. Let's get you out of bed and figure out our next move.
Aang went to slide the chair next to the bed so he could transfer Elora over, but she surprised him. Instead of sliding over to the chair, she rotated her hips until her legs were hanging off the bed. Elora carefully scooted forward until she could bend her knees and put her feet on the floor.
Come on, let's get me walking and you can give me the grand tour.
The rough wooden floor was uncomfortable on Elora's bare feet as she leaned on Aang, using the back of the chair to pull herself up. The small cabin immediately started spinning, so she closed her eyes and waited for it to pass. Just take a deep breath, count to 10.
Wow, this place really feels a lot smaller when you're vertical.
It didn't help that the roof was perhaps 10 centimeters above her head. If Elora ever did get her chance to do her cartwheels, it certainly wouldn't be in the cabin.
What would you like to see first?
Aang was certainly still cool towards her, but at least he was being civil. It would take a lot to repair their relationship, but without Stace, she could focus on him and hopefully turn his attitude around a little. They needed each other, and without the human, it would certainly be more obvious.
I want to see outside, but I need to take a piss. Mind showing me to the bathroom?
Aang's grin was unexpected as the two slowly made their way towards the vestibule door that led to the accommodations as well as to the greater outdoors.
You're going to love this. It's a hole.
Elora was slack-jawed as she stared into the outhouse. Aang grinned.
Yep, and now Stace and I don't have to clean up after you since you can fend for yourself.
And it's really cold in here.
You're complaining an awful lot for someone who needs to take a piss.
And there's the snook again. Help me get my pants down.
Once Aang had Elora situated, he had to think about his next step. She was alone in the outhouse, injured and unarmed. He could just barricade the door, lock her in. He could grab the pistol while she was in there, then use it to take charge. None of these ideas appealed to him. He didn't want to beat Elora, he wanted to make her an ally. Truly make her understand. By the time Elora was calling for help through the door, he had his plan. Elora's butt was freezing, but she wasn't about to let Aang know about it. She was a commander and she had to lead. When he helped her back out of the outhouse, she saw that Aang had cleared a section of a bench that had been piled with clothes and had prepared a few things. There was one of the fur blankets she had been using, and her boots. And the pistol.
We're running low on firewood in the house.
Aang pointed out.
Stace chopped some more before he left, but we need to bring it in.
Elora thought about the ache in her guts she already felt from just the moving around she had been doing. This was gonna suck.
How much do you need me to carry in?
Aang shook his head.
You aren't going to be carrying anything. Stace put me in charge of your care, and I think he would be a little put out if you were dead when he came back. I am going to be carrying in firewood, and you are going to be watching my back in case something dangerous decides to try to eat me. You can lean against the cabin, or I can drag out a chair for you.
Great. Playing guard while the male did all the work. Elora couldn't fault him for the plan, but it really chapped her lips that she wouldn't be able to do the real woman's work.
All right. Let me get my boots on and we can get to work.
It turns out that she wasn't the one putting her boots on. She couldn't even bend far enough to reach her feet while she was sitting down. Aang didn't say anything, just crouched down and started strapping the heavy combat boots on. Ellora just felt diminished. How could she be the one to take care of the two of them when she couldn't even put on shoes? Of course, the next problem was going to be what to wear. The pants and shirt she was wearing were fairly heavy fall weaves, but they were civilian clothing for off-duty wear in a much lower latitude. She was ashamed to realize that she hadn't been thinking about this problem. She had just assumed that she would work something out. Now that it was time to go out, she was unprepared. Aang had yet another solution for her. He had taken one of Stace's many knives and cut a slit in the middle of one of the furred animal skins she had been using as a blanket. Her head through the hole and a piece of rope for a belt, and she had at least some covering. While she loaded the pistol, Aang put on his outdoor clothes. Heavy shoes for traveling, pants that probably looked amazing stretched across his ass if it wasn't for the fact that he had some homemade insulating undergarments underneath making them all lumpy. Same with his shirt. A lightweight jacket that ended above his navel, entirely style and probably not helping at all with keeping him warm. Over that, one of Stace's spare homemade leather jackets at least 3 sizes too big. Thin cotton gloves. Battered and holed leather gloves he found somewhere on top of them. A hat that looked like somebody had turned an animal into a bowl. It was like a child wearing their adult's leftovers.
I think one of these hats might fit you. They are pretty beat up and don't smell great, but it's better than being cold. Everything else is probably too small. Still want to give it a try?
Aang looked concerned, but she had to be confident.
Give me one of those hats to keep my ears warm, then let's get to work. The sooner we get out there, the sooner we can be back inside without our slits freezing shut.
Aang thought he was ready when he opened the door, but he was wrong. He could admit that almost immediately. It was a bright and sunny morning and his eyes were instantly dazzled, the sun reflecting off of the snow that seemed to cover every surface, making him clamp his dark orbs nearly shut. The cold cut through his clothing like he was naked, and the wind threw tiny flakes against any exposed skin. The biting air was so cold it seemed to burn. The one saving grace was the reaction from Ellora. The tall, strong soldier almost immediately started coughing, clouds of steam coming off her as she seemed to shrink against him.
Breathe through your nose, keep your mouth closed.
He had learned that one quick.
Hang on to me. Do you want to look around a bit? We could walk down to the river.
Truth be told, he was ready to grab an armful of wood and sprint back to the cabin, but this wouldn't work if he gave up first. Ellora had to understand the amount of danger they were in. To her credit, the soldier took his advice and seemed to calm down a little. She kept one arm on Aang's shoulder and put the other under her makeshift poncho.
All right, let's see the river.
The two took slow, careful steps, braving the biting wind until they made it down the path far enough to get a good view of the river. It was perhaps 20 meters across where it was closest to the cabin, and the rime of frost and slush stuck out nearly a meter from each bank. They stood for a moment, watching chunks of ice float by from upstream and listening to the babble of the water punctuated by the occasional splash of fish. Ellora was already shivering, but her voice was firm.
I read a guidebook on ice fishing on the human's tablet. Once the river is frozen over, we can cut a hole in it and drop in a line to pull out the fish.
But you'd have to be sitting out here all day.
Aang thought perhaps Ellora's next shiver was more of a shudder.
Out in the wind.
Ellora nodded.
Thank you for showing me this. Let's get that firewood moved so we can get back inside and come up with a plan. My tits are freezing off.
I am going to die here. That was the first thought that crossed Ellora's mind when she was hit with the blast of icy cold. She was trying to keep it together, but when she was looking at the ice floating on the river, feeling that wind digging in, she knew that the two of them were properly fucked. She could even feel the seams on her clothing as the cold air wormed its way through the gaps in the stitching. The only thing remotely warm were her feet, and Ella was sure that was just because they had gone numb first. Ian didn't seem nearly so cold, but he was kitted out with as many layers of clothing as his little frame could wear. Even then, his skin looked pale and he was nearly running trying to get the wood into the cabin as fast as possible. Ella's shoulders where she leaned against the cabin felt like two slabs of ice, but she was afraid if she moved at all she would fall. That would really show Ian what sort of good and responsible leader she was. A quiet crunch in the snow drew her attention, and Ella glanced into the woods. She didn't see anything at first, the black and gold of her eyes searching until she saw a tiny movement and resolved it into a shape. She was being watched by an animal, a lanky quadruped with a pointed face and two erect ears. Its shaggy fur was grey and brown, blending almost perfectly into its surroundings. If it hadn't moved its head, Ella was sure she would have missed it. It reminded her of the dogs many humans kept, but bigger. It was staring her directly in the eyes. Once she knew what to look for, she was able to pick out another near the first. Then another, closer to the cabin and creeping forward carefully.
Ian. Get us in the cabin, now.
She drew the pistol out from where she had tucked it into the rope belt, felt the burn of the cold metal against her bare skin. To the male's credit, he dropped the wood he was carrying and moved directly to her. She leaned against him and carefully moved backwards, pointing the pistol at the creatures as they continued to move closer. She couldn't get a good shot, her hands were shaking with cold. This was bad. They kept moving backwards as they entered the cabin, and as soon as the pair was within the walls, Ella dropped the pistol so she could grab the door with trembling hands and slam it shut. The latch caught with a clunk and for a moment the two just stood panting, Ella leaning against both Ian and the door. They had just started to calm down when the scratching at the door started, the quiet snuffling of something trying to find a way in. Come on, soldier, think. The human has been out here for a decade, and something had to try to get in at least once. Ella looked at the door itself, then the frame. There were two slots in the door frame, sticking out farther than the door itself. A few more moments of searching, she found a wooden board leaned against the wall. It slid perfectly through one slot, across the door, and through the other, barring it closed. That done, the pair continued to slowly walk backwards until they were into the main cabin and that door was closed as well. It didn't have a bar like the other did, but even having another simple latch between the pair and... The two looked at each other for a moment before Ian spoke, his voice weak.
What in the goddess's name were those?
End of chapter. If you enjoyed, like, subscribe, and do all the YouTube stuff, visit and support the author, and I'll see you next time. If you didn't enjoy, comment on what I can do better. And as usual, have a wonderful day.